Welcome back to the ESCAP e-learning series on public-private partnerships, or PPPs. This module will introduce some of the different models of PPPs and highlight some of their key characteristics. When PPP models are discussed, you'll often hear technical acronyms like BOT, PFI, DBFM, and so on. These terms can create confusion for those of us who aren't experts in PPP terminology. To keep it clear, we will avoid using these terms in this module, and we will focus on two simple questions. What are the objectives you are trying to achieve, and what responsibilities are you allocating to the private sector? To structure this presentation, we will start from the left with models that feature more government control, where risks, obligations, and investment are mainly borne by the public sector, and where the private partnership is relatively short-term. We will then move gradually towards the right with progressively more involvement from the private sector. To decide which PPP model you want to use, you have first to clarify whether or not you expect the private sector to make capital investments to build or expand public infrastructure. Even if you're not seeking private capital investments, you might still want to employ a PPP model to achieve other objectives, such as improving the performance of a public asset. In one variety of PPP model, you might consider assigning the operation and maintenance of a public asset to a private partner and tying private partner payment to specific performance targets. Such linkage between performance and payment creates an incentive for the private operator to achieve higher efficiency. In the water sector, for example, the management of water utilities can be contracted out to private operators. To encourage efficiency gains, the private operators' payments are tied to specific targets, such as the volume of water saved through leakage reduction. In this model, there is no transfer of commercial risk. Payments to the private operator do not depend on utility tariffs or on the number of users. The absence of commercial risk for the private partner can make this model less challenging to implement. Another example of linking profit to performance is the performance-based road maintenance contract. This type of contract differs from the typical price per unit contract, where fees are paid in accordance with agreed-upon rates for maintenance items, such as a fixed fee per pothole filled in a road. The performance-based contract is instead based on agreed-upon standards that a contractor must maintain. For example, all potholes bigger than a certain dimension must be filled within a certain length of time. If the standards are met, the contractor can collect the full fee. If not, penalties are applied. Hence, the private operator is incentivized to maintain the asset in good condition. The performance-based model also provides cost certainty to the government. If compliance with the maintenance standards set by the contract is more costly than anticipated, such cost overruns will be borne by the private partner. In other words, the maintenance risk is transferred to the private sector. This kind of model changes the dynamic of government involvement considerably, from paying for maintenance on a per-unit basis to monitoring asset performance based on set maintenance indicators. This requires important internal adjustments on the part of the public partner to establish the monitoring protocols that ensure the contract delivers the targeted results. So, what are the advantages of this model from the perspective of a government? Use of a performance-based model allows you to benefit from the efficiency and expertise of the private sector to improve service delivery. You also reduce your own risk by transferring operational and maintenance risks to the private sector. This model is also relatively straightforward and quick to implement. On the other hand, you can only employ this model with existing infrastructure, as the private partner in this case is not making any capital investments. You transfer only a limited amount of risk. For example, there is no transfer of commercial risk. A private partner might also be reluctant to accept the maintenance risks of an asset that it has not constructed if attaining a comprehensive assessment of its condition is not immediately feasible. That concludes our first variety of PPP model. Another type of PPP model involves leasing. With leasing, the private contractor pays a fee for operating an existing public asset and collecting revenue derived from that asset's operation, while the initial capital investment remains the responsibility of the public authority. A classic example of this is a container terminal where the public authority leases out the terminal infrastructure to a private partner. The private partner makes the required investments to facilitate operations, such as cranes and warehouse, and then charges users for handling containers. In this case, the commercial risk is borne by the private sector, as profit depends on the number of containers handled. The duration of contracts in PPP leasing models are typically long enough to allow private partners to see returns on their operational investments. For the government, the advantages of this model are twofold. First, you generate increased revenue from a pre-existing asset. Second, you improve service delivery through efficiency gains brought by the private partners. However, some regulatory oversight needs to be put in place. For example, regulation might be required to prevent private operators from taking advantage of their monopoly position by overcharging users. Now, let's have a look at the PPP models where the private partner makes significant investments to build or rehabilitate a public asset. This type of partnership usually features extended contract duration to allow the private partner to recoup its investment, typically over 20 years. The arrangement can involve two possible sources of revenue for the private partner. The revenue stream can either come from charging the users of the asset or directly from the government through availability payments. A toll road project is a typical example of the user fee approach where the private company builds the roads and operates it for a number of years before transferring the ownership back to the government. In exchange, the private partner has the right to collect tolls from users. The availability payment approach has been used extensively in the social sector to build and maintain hospitals and schools. In this arrangement, the government makes regular payments to the private partner, provided that the public asset is available and maintained at contractual performance standards. Working with a private partner in this way to build or rehabilitate a public asset offers a series of advantages. Efficiency gains may now be realized in all phases of the project, as the private partner is responsible for designing, building, and maintaining the asset. More risks are transferred to the private partner, including the construction risk. In this model, the asset is also financed with private capital, reducing demand on public finances. This kind of model also features limitations. The structural complexity of this kind of partnership can require extensive negotiation. The government might also have to provide subsidies and public guarantees to make these projects financially viable. Private financing is also more costly than public borrowing. PPP projects must offer enough efficiency gains to compensate these higher financing costs. The dynamics of the final PPP alternative we'd like to discuss are similar to those of the previous PPP investment model, with the exception that asset rights do not revert to the government at the conclusion of the partnership, and the ownership of the asset remains in the private sector. The public sector maintains, however, a critical role for the infrastructure development. In the energy sector, for example, the public authority might be the main client of the infrastructure to be built via the signature of a long-term power purchase agreement. Under this agreement, the public entity takes the commitment to buy electricity from a private company at an agreed price, thereby making the project financially feasible. In the telecom sector, although investments are made by private companies, Public authorities may also play an active role as a regulator. Such regulatory participation includes granting licenses to mobile telephone operators and ensuring that sector competition is sufficient to drive prices down. When it comes to partnership and cooperation among the public and private sectors, there are many examples and options available, and a variety of PPP arrangements can be employed to maintain and create infrastructure. PPP arrangements can be an attractive alternative to increase and improve the supply of infrastructure services, and it is important to consider the characteristics of different PPP models and weigh the benefits and limitations of each when considering PPP options. That concludes the second module of ESCAP's e-learning series on public-private partnerships. We hope we provided some insight into the variety of PPP models available. Thank you for watching and for your interest in ESCAP's work. Please check out ESCAP's website for more information and additional resources on PPPs at www.unescap.org.